Welcome to a journey back to 1963, perhaps the most significant hinge year in 20th century British history. It was a time of extraordinary contrasts, a year that began in a state of physical paralysis under a blanket of ice and ended with a nation's social hierarchies forever altered by a musical revolution and political scandal. For many, 1963 marked the definitive end of post-war austerity and the beginning of the liberated Technicolor latter half of the decade. In these 12 months, the stiff upper lip of traditional Britain began to quiver. We saw the spread of a new youth culture that repositioned the teenager as the primary driver of the economy. From the emergence of Beatlemania and the launch of Doctor Who, to the shockwaves of the Profumo affair and the audacity of the Great Train Robbery, 1963 was a heck of a year for modern Britain. The year did not start with a swing, but with a shiver. The big freeze of 1963 remains one of the coldest winters on record. A brutal 10-week lockdown of ice and snow that began on Boxing Day 1962 and didn't truly thaw until early March. Nowadays we'd use the term Baltic. For London it was the coldest January since 1841. For many others it was a test of survival. On Tyneside they even had to put a jacket on to go out. Temperatures plummeted as low as minus 21 degrees Celsius. I worked in minus 15 in the winter of 2010. I'll not be doing that again, that's for sure. Across the country, snowdrifts reached 20 feet deep, isolating hundreds of villages and bringing down power lines. In a time before central heating was standard, nearly a third of the population still didn't have a plumbed-in bathroom, and 6 million people shared outside lavatories that frequently froze solid. People had to scrape frost off the inside of their windows just to see out, but all you could see was snow anyway. The disruption was total. The sea froze for up to a mile from the shore at Herne Bay in Kent, and ice stretched 5 miles out from the coast at Dunkirk. Inland, the River Thames froze so thickly in Oxfordshire that motorists actually drove their cars across the ice. It was a costly winter, with the physical toll estimated at around £200 million, or roughly $5 billion in today's money. Thanks to the rapid growth of the motor car, there were a few new options to drive your shiny new car on. The first section of the M4 opened in Berkshire, the M6 linked Warrington and Preston in Lancashire, and the M2 in Kent also opened up. And if you were treating yourself to a new car that year, it might have been the new Vauxhall Viva, launched in 1963, or maybe a Ford Anglia, after Ford started building them at its new factory on Merseyside. Or were you a bit flashier and stretched to one of the Rover P6 models, which was the first winner of the European Car of the Year award? Neither my mum or dad ever learned to drive, as owning and running a car wasn't an option. They just wouldn't have been able to afford one anyway, never mind run the thing, but I digress. Whatever you were driving, you might have had the opportunity to drive through the Dartford tunnel for the first time. The infrastructure of the old world was being dismantled quite literally by the Beeching report, which called for the closure of more than 2,000 railway stations and a brutal rationalisation of the network. It would also lead to the loss of nearly 70,000 jobs and the scrapping of some 8,000 train carriages surplus to requirements. Yet, as the trains stopped running to rural villages, the sounds coming out of the hip parts of London were beginning to reach every corner of the country via transistor radios and the television. As the music evolved, so did the look of Britain. London was transforming into the epicentre of cool, a movement later branded Swinging London. The heart of this scene was Carnaby Street in Soho. I suppose no one thought of calling it Cool Britannia back then. That would have its day in the 90s Britpop era. Although Cool Britannia was a track on the first LP from the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band, the term just never caught on to describe the 60s movement. Boutique owner Mary Quant led a fashion youthquake, abolishing dowdy hemlines in favour of the miniskirt. The mini was designed to be liberating, allowing women to run and jump in a way that would have been outrageous a decade earlier. Youths were moving away from the short back and sides of their parents. Boys adopted the mop-top look made famous by the Beatles, or the sharp tailored suits and parkers of the mods. The mod subculture, which emerged in London in the early 60s, was an aspirational movement of working-class youth who spent their disposable income on sharp Italian suits and Vespa or Lambretta scooters. They lived for all-nighter clubbing at events like The Scene in Soho, often fueled by amphetamines to keep the party going. June 1963 also saw the opening of Annabelle's private members club in Mayfair, party central for the international jet set, as they headed to what was said to be one of the first nightclubs in London. For the British public, one of the most visible casualties of the freeze was sport. The national obsession with football was ground to a halt. Between December and February, the Football League fixture list and the FA Cup schedule became a chaotic mess, with matches postponed more than 10 times. Bolton Wanderers, for instance, played no competitive football for 10 weeks straight. This created a unique crisis for the gambling industry. Millions relied on the football pools for weekend entertainment, but there were no matches to bet on. The solution was the creation of the Pools Panel on the 23rd of January 1963. This body of experts, including 3 ex-footballers and a Tory MP, met behind closed doors to adjudicate the hypothetical results of postponed matches. Though some called it a farce, it kept the weekly ritual alive until the thaw finally arrived in March. When the season finally resumed, it was a historic one. In England, Everton claimed the First Division title, their first post-war championship. Manchester United won the FA Cup with a 3-1 victory over Leicester City, their first major trophy since the 1958 Munich air disaster. Up here in Scotland, Rangers dominated, securing the Scottish League Division 1 title and completing the double by defeating Celtic 3-0 in a Scottish Cup replay. On the European stage, Tottenham Hotspur made history by becoming the first British club to win a European trophy, lifting the Cup Winners' Cup after thrashing Atletico Madrid 5-1 in Rotterdam. As the snow finally melted, a new kind of heat began to rise from Liverpool. 1963 was the year the Beatles really took off. While they had reached number 17 with Love Me Do in late 1962, it was the February release of Please Please Me that changed everything. It hit the top of the charts and sparked full-blown Beatlemania, a term first widely used by the Daily Mirror in October to describe the hysterical, screaming crowds of teenagers that followed the band everywhere. The Fab Four's debut album, also titled Please Please Me, was recorded in a single legendary 10-hour session in February. Released in March, it spent a record 30 weeks at number 1, only to be knocked off the top spot by their follow-up, With the Beatles, in November. Their success signalled a seismic shift. Pop music was no longer just polite entertainment, but a raw, high-energy soundtrack for a new generation. By the end of the year, they had racked up 3 number 1 singles, From Me to You, She Loves You, and I Want to Hold Your Hand. But the Beatles weren't the only ones shaking up the airwaves. Their fellow Liverpudlians, Jerry and the Pacemakers, enjoyed breakout success with How Do You Do It? Meanwhile, London produced a grittier rival, the Rolling Stones. Under the management of 19-year-old Andrew Loog Oldham, the Stones cultivated a bad boy image that contrasted sharply with the Beatles' dapper suits. They released their first single, a cover of Chuck Berry's Come On, in June. This musical explosion was fueled by the rise of pirate radio stations like Radio Caroline, which broadcast non-stop rock and pop from ships at sea, bypassing the BBC's conservative programming. And in a landmark moment for the industry, October saw the very first Brit Awards ceremony, then known as the BPI Awards, at the Royal Albert Hall, where Cliff Richard took top prizes alongside upstarts like the Beatles. On the small screen, 1963 was equally revolutionary. On the 23rd of November, the BBC launched a pioneering science fiction series called Doctor Who, introducing William Hartnell as the mysterious Doctor. The first episode, An Unearthly Child, featured school teachers discovering a time machine disguised as a blue police box in a London junkyard. The launch was tragically overshadowed. News of the assassination of US President John F. Kennedy reached the UK just after 6:30 p.m. on the 22nd of November, leading the BBC to repeat the first episode of Doctor Who the following week because so many had missed it. Despite this rocky start, the show introduced the Daleks in December, which immediately captured the public's imagination and cemented the show as a national institution. I wasn't around in 1963, so I missed the first two Doctors completely. I have vague memories of John Pertwee playing the Doctor, but I was still young when he finished his stint in 1974. Tom Baker, the fourth Doctor, was the Doctor from my era. I loved it, especially the Cybermen, and the Daleks, of course. Music and TV collided on the 9th of August with the premiere of Ready Steady Go on ITV, with the slogan "The Weekend Starts Here." Hosted by the stylish Cathy McGowan, the show featured a young trendy audience dancing around the bands in a cramped live studio environment. It became the ultimate showcase for the mod aesthetic and bands like the Stones and the Who. An old favourite of mine, World in Action, the investigative current affairs programme, saw its debut in '63. That was made by Granada Television and ran for 35 years. At its peak, more than 20 million were tuning in. On the satirical front, the BBC's That Was the Week That Was reached its cultural apex. Hosted by David Frost, the show gleefully dismantled the British establishment with biting wit. However, it proved too controversial for some and aired for the last time in December 1963. While youth culture was blooming, the established order was crumbling. 1963 saw the Profumo affair, a scandalous mix of sex, spies and government that shattered public trust in the ruling class. In June, Secretary of State for War John Profumo confessed to having an extramarital affair with 19-year-old model Christine Keeler. The scandal deepened when it was revealed that Keeler was also involved with Yevgeny Ivanov, a Soviet naval attaché and suspected spy. While an inquiry by Lord Denning later concluded no security leaks had occurred, the damage was done. Profumo had initially lied to the House of Commons in March, denying any impropriety. When the truth came out, it exposed systemic hypocrisy within elite society. The stiff upper lip was gone, replaced by a culture of scepticism and tabloid scrutiny. The fallout brought an ignominious end to Harold Macmillan's Conservative government. He resigned in October, citing ill health, and was replaced by Alec Douglas-Home. This political upheaval paved the way for Harold Wilson and the Labour Party to take power the following year. Wilson had succeeded Hugh Gaitskell as Labour leader after Gaitskell had died suddenly in January at the age of just 56. As we all sadly know, American President John F. Kennedy was assassinated that year, which overshadowed the deaths of writers C.S. Lewis and Aldous Huxley, who died on the same date. The final word in politics for this section is reserved for Charles de Gaulle, who vetoed the UK's entry into the EEC way back in January, as if things weren't frosty enough that month, eh? 1963 also saw one of the most audacious heists in British history. In the early hours of 8th of August, a 15-member gang, led by Bruce Reynolds, stopped the Glasgow to London night mail train at a bridge in Buckinghamshire. They made off with £2.6 million, the equivalent of 50 million today, in what was quickly dubbed the Great Train Robbery. Figures like Ronnie Biggs and Buster Edwards became unlikely household names in a nation increasingly fascinated by anti-establishment defiance. But 1963 was also a year for more serious social justice. In Bristol, a milestone for civil rights was reached with the Bristol bus boycott, sparked by the refusal of the Bristol Omnibus Company to employ black or Asian crews. The 4-month boycott drew national attention to racial discrimination in Britain. It ended in victory on the 28th of August, the same day Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech, and was influential in the passing of the Race Relations Act of 1965. There were some dark and sinister events happening in the northwest that year. 2 children were abducted and murdered, and would later be forever linked as the first 2 victims of the Moors murderers, Brady and Hindley. Internationally, the map of the world was changing. Britain's imperial power continued to wane as Kenya and Zanzibar gained independence in December, joining those from the previous video going it alone. Meanwhile, the Aden crisis in the Middle East highlighted the violent struggle to maintain the last vestiges of the empire. At the cinema, Britain was caught between 2 worlds. On one hand, kitchen sink realism reached its peak with films like This Sporting Life and Billy Liar, which explored the gritty, bleak reality of working class life in the industrial north. On the other, the glamorous, high-tech escapism of James Bond was becoming a global phenomenon with the release of From Russia with Love in October. We also saw the continued popularity of the Carre On films, with Carre On Cabby delivering the series' trademark innuendo and slapstick. Our old friend Cliff Richard starred in the musical film Summer Holiday, also released in 1963. In literature, 1963 was a year for breaking taboos. Novels like Mary McCarthy's The Group and Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar, published under a pseudonym, challenged traditional ideas about gender and identity. John le Carre's The Spy Who Came In From the Cold also debuted, reflecting the era's deepening Cold War anxieties. For the kids, 1963 saw the debut of the Cindy doll, marketed as the doll you love to dress, to compete with the American Barbie. For the home, the Astra, or lava lamp, was launched by Edward Craven Walker, its swirling, vibrant shapes perfectly capturing the emerging psychedelic influence of the decade. As we look back, 1963 was the primary hinge on which the British 20th century turned. It was the year we as a nation stopped looking back at our wartime past and started looking toward a permissive, technological and globalised future. By the end of December, the ice of the Big Freeze was a distant memory, replaced by the white heat of a cultural revolution. Britain was no longer the same. It was now a nation in flux, balanced between a fading imperial heyday and an uncertain but exhilarating new age. Thank you for joining me for this nostalgic look back at 1963. It truly was the year the 60s began to swing. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more journeys into history.